A millionaire followed a little beggar girl who had stolen from him on the street. When the millionaire saw what the beggar girl was going to do, he began to cry. The city buzzed with life, its crowded streets a symphony of clinking coins, hurried footsteps, and distant car horns. Alexander Warren, a man who effortlessly commanded attention with his tailored suit and silver-streaked hair, strode down Main Street. He was known as the city's youngest self-made millionaire, an enigma of calculated decisions and sharp intellect. But today, amidst the chaotic dance of pedestrians, his cold, business-focused gaze softened. It happened in a heartbeat. A nimble figure darted past him, brushing his side. He felt the tug at his pocket, swift, practiced, almost imperceptible. Instinctively, Alexander spun around, catching a fleeting glimpse of the perpetrator. A girl no older than 12, her matted hair framed by a tattered scarf. Her small frame melted into the crowded sea, a wisp of desperation in a city that swallowed the weak. Alexander's first impulse was indignation, a flash of anger at the audacity of being robbed in broad daylight. But that feeling was quickly overtaken by something unexpected, a spark of curiosity that pulled at his consciousness. Without thinking twice, he followed her, weaving between bystanders who barely noticed him. The chase led him through alleyways reeking of neglect and past dilapidated storefronts. He felt a gnawing sense of unease as the opulent world he knew receded behind him, replaced by the underbelly of the city where survival was the only language spoken. She slipped into an old, decaying building with cracked windows and a weather-beaten facade. Alexander paused outside, his breath hitching. This was the kind of place he'd read about in distant charity reports, but never witnessed firsthand. Peering in through a sliver in the wooden door, he saw her set down her stolen prize, a couple of crumpled bills and a few coins. 3 younger children rushed to her, their faces lighting up not with the joy of carefree youth, but with the fragile relief of a temporary reprieve from hunger. "Sarah, did you get enough for today?" one of the boys asked, his voice a mixture of hope and worry. The girl nodded, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges. "Yeah, Tommy, we'll have bread and maybe some soup," she said, her voice trembling with both pride and exhaustion. Alexander stepped back, the hard thump of his heartbeat ringing in his ears. The scene before him twisted something deep in his chest. The girl was no simple thief. She was a guardian, an unyielding force defying odds he couldn't imagine. He clenched his fists, a war waging within him. This was not his world, not his battle. Yet the image of her tenderly shielding those children from the cold realities of poverty clawed at the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. He exhaled slowly, a rare warmth spreading through his veins. This was no coincidence. Decisions in his world were made with logic. But now, standing there amid peeling paint and echoes of laughter mixed with tears, Alexander Warren felt something entirely foreign. A call to act, not with the mind, but with the heart. Alexander lingered outside the building, its cracked walls and sagging door bearing silent witness to years of neglect. He hesitated, the rational part of him urging him to turn away and return to the safe confines of his high-rise office, where problems were measured in profit margins and stocks. Yet he couldn't. A strange compulsion held him there, rooted to the spot, as if crossing this threshold would unravel something long buried within him. With a steadying breath, he pushed the door open a fraction and slipped inside, careful not to draw attention. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and rust. His polished shoes scuffed against the wooden floor, splintered and worn from countless footsteps. He moved quietly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through torn curtains. The girl, whom he now knew as Sarah, was huddled in the corner of a narrow room. It was barely more than a storage space, cluttered with mismatched furniture and patched blankets. Her siblings sat around her, 3 pairs of eyes wide with anticipation as Sarah doled out slices of bread, their edges stale but accepted eagerly. Their thin arms and hollow cheeks spoke of a hunger that went beyond the physical. It was the gnawing deprivation of hope. "Here, take mine, Mikey," Sarah said, pressing her piece into the hands of the youngest boy, no older than 5. The boy's eyes shimmered with gratitude as he took a bite, his small smile breaking through the dirt-smudged face. The scene, so tender and fierce in its simplicity, struck Alexander with a force he hadn't felt in years. He saw not just a child stealing to survive, but a leader, a protector in a world that offered her no protection. The room seemed to pulse with unspoken stories. A broken toy soldier lay forgotten near a stained mattress. Drawings, done in a childish scrawl, decorated the walls. Fantastical monsters vanquished by heroes with capes. Alexander's throat tightened as he pieced together the fragments of their lives. Every corner, every threadbare possession told a story of resilience and silent suffering. He watched as Sarah sat back, her face a canvas of fatigue too deep for someone her age. Her eyes scanned the room, counting each sibling with a quick glance to reassure herself that they were there, safe for now. There was a flicker of something raw in her eyes, a fear that tomorrow might not be so kind. Alexander felt an unfamiliar prickling at the corners of his eyes. He took a step back, his foot scraping against a loose floorboard. The sound was enough to snap Sarah's head up, her eyes darting toward the intruder. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice sharp with the practiced bravado of someone used to fending off danger. Alexander swallowed hard, stepping into the soft glow of a dying light bulb. He expected anger, fear, maybe even a rush to escape. Instead, Sarah's eyes narrowed with defiance, her shoulders squaring protectively in front of her siblings. "It's okay," he said, raising his hands as if approaching a skittish animal. "I mean no harm. I wanted to see if you're all right." Sarah's eyes darted between him and the children. "Why? You're just another man in a suit. You don't belong here," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the trembling fingers that clutched the bread. He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the tangle of emotions swirling inside him. The man who never hesitated to close a deal or fire an employee stood frozen, words failing him. For the first time in years, he found himself vulnerable, unable to hide behind wealth or power. "I know I don't," he admitted, his voice quieter, tinged with an honesty he hadn't known he possessed. "But maybe I want to." Sarah's gaze softened, just for a moment, before she turned her attention back to her brothers, dismissing him with a practiced indifference. Alexander stood there, the gap between their worlds a chasm he wasn't sure how to bridge. But in that instant, with the echo of hungry children's laughter around him, he knew he had to try. The walk back to his car felt longer than it should have. Alexander's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts as he replayed the encounter over and over. The weight of what he had seen pressed heavily on his chest, a burden unfamiliar and unrelenting. He opened the car door and sat behind the wheel, staring blankly at the dashboard, fingers drumming nervously against the leather steering wheel. This wasn't him. Alexander Warren, the celebrated financier and shrewd negotiator, didn't chase street urchins or step into crumbling buildings out of curiosity. He was a man of numbers, of cold facts and logical steps. Yet here he was, unable to shake the image of Sarah and her brothers. The rawness in their eyes was a stark contrast to the polished halls and perfumed air of his life. As he pulled away from the curb, the city blurred around him. The skyscrapers that once stood as symbols of his success now loomed like judgmental giants. The children's faces haunted him, their silence louder than any of the meetings that crowded his daily schedule. Every streetlight he passed felt like a spotlight, casting shadows that whispered, "Do something. Don't walk away." He parked in the garage of his luxurious penthouse and stepped into the cool, sterile foyer. The echo of his shoes on the marble floor reminded him of the void he called home. The art on the walls, abstract pieces he'd chosen for their reputation rather than personal connection, felt as distant as ever. Dropping his briefcase by the door, he loosened his tie, the silk fabric suddenly feeling like a noose. The city lights outside his panoramic windows blinked, a glittering sea of ambition and excess. Alexander's phone buzzed with reminders of late-night conference calls and financial updates. He ignored it, his gaze slipping past the neon glow to the memory of Sarah's hardened expression. She was fighting a battle he couldn't comprehend, yet her determination had pierced through his armor of indifference. With a sigh, he sank into the leather armchair in his study. It was the only place that felt lived in, filled with books from years when he still read for pleasure, before life became a checklist of acquisitions and deals. Pulling out an old photo album, he flipped through pages yellowed with age. The pictures were a window to a simpler time, a small boy with scraped knees, eyes bright with curiosity, playing in the yard of a house that no longer existed. It had been demolished along with the dreams his parents once held. The memories clawed at him, dragging him back to a childhood where scarcity was a familiar guest. The resonance of that feeling hit him unexpectedly. He remembered the nights of counting loose change on the kitchen table, hoping it was enough for dinner. The face of a stranger who once offered them a hot meal at their lowest ebb flashed in his mind. That man had been an anonymous lifeline, an act of kindness Alexander had long buried under layers of success and self-preservation. Now the past and present collided, twisting his gut with guilt and recognition. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had shifted inside him, an unsettling need to act, to be more than a passive observer. But what could he do? Money was the answer to everything in his world, yet it felt inadequate now, like offering a bandage for a wound that needed stitching. "I have to go back," he muttered, the decision taking root in his heart. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a compulsion. He needed to see Sarah again, not just as a shadow following her, but as someone who might make a difference. The resolve warmed him as he dialed a number on his phone. A familiar voice answered. "Mr. Warren, this is Mrs. Greer from Community Outreach Services." "To what do I owe the pleasure?" the woman said, her tone professional, masking a touch of surprise. "I need information on shelters and programs for children," Alexander replied, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "And I'd like to discuss setting up a private fund." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, Mr. Warren. We can arrange that." Hanging up, Alexander felt the first breath of hope stir within him. It was a small step, but the image of Sarah and her siblings flickered in his mind, reminding him that some small steps can lead to greater journeys. The next afternoon, Alexander returned to the narrow streets where the world of suits and skyscrapers didn't dare to tread. He parked a few blocks away from the building he now knew as Sarah's refuge and approached on foot, a satchel hanging from his shoulder, its weight unfamiliar but necessary. It was filled with essentials, bread, canned goods, and a few blankets. The notion seemed naive to him, a billionaire thinking he could bring hope in a bag. But he pressed on, uncertain and determined. He knocked lightly on the worn wooden door. The moment stretched, silent except for the muffled city hum in the distance. Just when he considered leaving the bag and walking away, the door creaked open a sliver, one wary eye peering through the gap. "You again," Sarah said, her tone unreadable. "Yes," Alexander replied, keeping his hands visible to show he meant no harm. "I thought you could use some help." She blinked, her expression shifting between distrust and disbelief. A suit-clad stranger on her doorstep, holding supplies, was not part of her daily reality. "Why?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively. Alexander hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain this foreign urge that had taken root within him, the compulsion that led him to this moment. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he finally said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a start. The door creaked wider, and Sarah glanced back at her brothers. They watched from behind her with wide, uncertain eyes. She turned back to Alexander, assessing him with a gaze far too old for her years. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him in with a nod that was more warning than invitation. Inside, the air was warmer than he remembered, not from heat, but from the closeness of bodies and life condensed into a few square feet. The youngest, Mikey, shuffled behind Sarah, eyeing Alexander with both fear and curiosity. The middle child, Tommy, clutched a threadbare toy, his knuckles white. "I brought some things," Alexander said, opening the satchel slowly and setting it down. He pulled out a loaf of bread and a can of soup, placing them on the small, rickety table. The boy's eyes lit up, their restraint crumbling at the sight of real food. Sarah's expression softened, and she took a step closer, inspecting the contents as if they might vanish. "Is this for us?" Tommy whispered, breaking the tension. Alexander nodded, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Yes, all for you." Mikey let out a giggle, unable to contain his excitement, and darted forward to touch the bread, as if confirming it was real. The sight tugged at something deep within Alexander, something buried under years of boardroom battles and business triumphs. He hadn't seen such raw joy in a long time, unfiltered and pure. Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw the walls around her crack. "Why are you really here?" she asked, quieter this time, the question heavy with suspicion and vulnerability. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I grew up knowing what it's like to need help," he said, voice steady but low. "And someone once helped me when I didn't expect it. I guess it's my turn now." Silence settled in the room, not awkward but contemplative. Sarah's stance relaxed, and she shifted her weight, as if deciding whether to trust this stranger with the worn shoes that didn't match his expensive suit. Finally, she nodded, the smallest gesture, but it felt monumental. "Thank you," she whispered, the sincerity in her voice almost breaking him. Alexander nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest that wasn't unwelcome. It was empathy recognition, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. He stayed a little longer, helping them set up the food and explaining how to use the canned goods. When he finally stood to leave, Mikey tugged at his sleeve, his small voice hopeful. "Will you come back?" the boy asked. Alexander's throat tightened. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with an intensity that demanded an honest answer. "Yes," he said, smiling. "I'll come back." As he walked out into the fading light of the afternoon, the sound of children's laughter, tentative but real, followed him. It was a sound that promised he would return, not just for them, but for himself. Alexander kept his promise. Over the next few weeks, he visited the old building regularly, always bringing food, warm clothes, or books. It wasn't long before Sarah and her brothers began to look forward to his visits, their guarded expressions giving way to cautious smiles. With each visit, Alexander felt a shift, not just in the children but in himself. The cold armor he'd spent years perfecting was starting to crack, letting in the warmth he hadn't known he needed. One evening, as winter crept into the city with its chill, Alexander arrived with an armful of firewood and blankets. Sarah met him at the door, a small, reluctant smile breaking through the usual mask of suspicion. "You're late today," she said, more a statement than an accusation. Alexander chuckled. "Traffic," he replied, the word sounding absurd given their surroundings. He set the firewood by the small stove they used and glanced around the room. The boys were huddled under a patchwork quilt, flipping through an old comic book he had brought during his last visit. They waved at him, and Mikey, ever the bold one, ran over to show him a page with a superhero mid-flight. "Look, it's you," Mikey exclaimed, pointing at the hero in the comic. Alexander laughed, though the sentiment settled in his chest like a gentle weight. Sarah watched the exchange, her eyes softening. She motioned for him to sit on a stool beside her. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the crackle of the stove filling the room. It was Sarah who finally broke the quiet, her voice careful, as if testing a fragile bridge. "Why did you say someone helped you once?" she asked, looking down at her hands, which were busy unraveling and readying a loose thread on her sweater. Alexander's smile faltered, replaced by an expression that spoke of a long-buried memory. He shifted, staring at the floor before meeting her gaze. "I was a kid like you. My father lost his job, and we struggled. It was just me and him after my mother passed. We had nights where there was nothing to eat, and hope felt like a story you told to make yourself sleep." He paused, the room seeming smaller as it absorbed his confession. "One winter night, an old man who lived a few blocks from us knocked on our door. He brought food and firewood, enough to last a month. He didn't know us. He just knew we needed help." Alexander's voice was softer now, each word dipped in gratitude. "It saved us, in more ways than I could explain." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide and glistening. She didn't speak, but he could see the understanding there. After a beat, she nodded, as if acknowledging a silent agreement between them. "It's hard," she said almost to herself. "Taking care of everyone." He nodded, the image of her holding her brothers close in the darkness replaying in his mind. "It is. But you do it, and you do it well." Sarah's eyes darted to him, startled by the compliment. She opened her mouth, then hesitated, as if weighing whether to let him into the part of her story she kept locked away. Finally, she drew a shaky breath. "Our parents died in an accident last year. It was sudden. One day, everything was normal, and the next we were alone." Her voice wavered but didn't break. "We couldn't go to a shelter. They'd split us up, and I couldn't let that happen. So we stayed here. The raw honesty of her words silenced Alexander. He felt a surge of admiration for the girl, who had managed to hold her family together against all odds. His own struggles suddenly felt smaller, less insurmountable compared to the daily battle she waged. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, the words inadequate but true. She shrugged, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We make do," she said, echoing the resilience that had become her mantra. But her eyes, for once, seemed to carry less of the burden she wore so fiercely. Alexander glanced at the boys, their laughter punctuating the moment like a reminder of why it all mattered. He turned back to Sarah. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Her gaze met his, tentative hope glimmering beneath the doubt. For the first time she nodded, not just as acknowledgement but as acceptance. That night, as Alexander drove back through the maze of city lights, Sarah's words lingered. The revelation of her parents' accident haunted him, pulling him deeper into the web of responsibilities he never imagined taking on. The cityscape, usually so familiar and comforting, felt colder now, each tower and neon sign a silent witness to countless stories of struggle hidden in the alleys below. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power. Polished mahogany, sleek leather chairs, and a skyline view that seemed to promise the world. Yet none of it held the same meaning. His mind wandered back to Sarah's determined eyes, and the way her voice wavered, but never cracked when she spoke about protecting her brothers. "Mr. Warren, are you all right?" came the voice of Elise, his assistant, as she walked in with a stack of reports. Her eyebrows pinched together in concern when she saw him staring blankly out the window. He snapped out of his reverie, forcing a smile. "Yes, Elise. Just reconsidering some priorities." Elise nodded, accustomed to his cryptic responses. But before she could leave, Alexander spoke up. "Elise, could you schedule a meeting with Community Outreach Services? And I'll need details on every nonprofit that works with children and families at risk in the city." Her eyes widened. "Of course, Mr. Warren. Right away." After she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair. The decision had solidified overnight. The days of watching and sympathizing from the sidelines were over. He had power, influence, and more resources than most would see in a lifetime. It was time to use them for something more than personal gain. That evening, as the office quieted and the hum of city traffic rose to fill the silence, Alexander received a call. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Greer, the Director of Community Outreach Services. "Mr. Warren, I understand you're interested in supporting our programs. It's a pleasure to hear from you." "Yes, I am," he said, the confidence in his tone reassuring him that this was the right path. "I'd like to discuss ways I can contribute, not just financially, but through direct involvement." There was a pause, and when Mrs. Greer spoke again, her voice carried a note of pleasant surprise. "We'd be honored. When can you meet?" "Tomorrow," he said without hesitation. The next day brought an air of anticipation. The boardroom in the community outreach building was modest compared to the glass-paneled spaces Alexander was used to, but it was alive with purpose. Photographs of volunteers and the families they'd helped lined the walls, each one a testament to resilience. As Mrs. Greer spoke, detailing their programs and urgent needs, Alexander's mind raced with ideas. "I want to start a fund," he interrupted gently. "Something specifically for children who are caretakers for their siblings. Kids who fall through the cracks because they're too proud or too scared to seek help." Mrs. Greer's eyes sparkled, a smile breaking across her face. "Mr. Warren, that could change lives." "It has to," he said, thinking of Sarah and the countless others like her, who faced the world with small shoulders burdened by big responsibilities. The meeting ended with plans in motion, names of potential partners exchanged, and a spark of hope ignited. As Alexander walked back to his car, a message pinged on his phone. It was a photo Elise had sent, a candid shot of Alexander at the outreach meeting. She had added a caption, "A change worth seeing." He stared at the photo for a moment. The man in the picture unfamiliar, but somehow truer to himself than he had been in years. A sense of peace settled over him, different from the adrenaline rush of closing a business deal. This was deeper, more real. The following week, Alexander found himself outside Sarah's building once more. But this time he wasn't empty-handed. With him was a team from community outreach, equipped with supplies and plans to renovate the space to make it safer and warmer. Sarah stood at the doorway, eyes wide with disbelief, as she watched workers unload crates filled with building materials and food. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion but colored by hope. "It's a start," Alexander said, stepping forward. "For you and others who need it." She stared at him, the guarded look giving way to something brighter. For the first time, she let herself smile. A true, uninhibited smile that seemed to light up the shadows of the room behind her. "Thank you," she said, the weight of the words not lost on him. And as the workers moved around them, turning that small, broken space into a haven, Alexander knew that he was no longer just a man in a suit passing by. He was part of something bigger, something worthwhile. The renovation of Sarah's makeshift home progressed faster than expected. Walls that had once crumbled were reinforced. Windows that had kept out neither cold nor heat were replaced. And the old splintered floor now bore new wooden panels that felt solid and warm. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust lingered in the air, an aroma that to Sarah smelled like hope. Alexander visited almost daily, overseeing the work and bringing small gifts for the children. A new set of colored pencils for Tommy, storybooks for Mikey, and even a warm coat for Sarah. At first, she resisted accepting these tokens, pride and habit pulling her back. But slowly, with each passing day and each act of kindness, her barriers began to fall. One late afternoon, as the workers packed up and the noise of drills and hammers quieted, Sarah approached Alexander. She stood with her arms folded, a defensive habit she hadn't yet let go of, but there was a different look in her eyes, one that suggested she was ready to let him in a little further. "Why did you come back?" she asked, the question hanging between them like an invisible bridge. Alexander took a moment before replying, leaning against the newly patched wall, his gaze softening. "Because you reminded me of myself," he said simply. "I know what it's like to feel like the world is on your shoulders, and no one's there to help." Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile, but she nodded instead. The quiet acknowledgement between them was louder than any words. "Do you have anyone?" she asked hesitantly. The question was loaded, not just with curiosity, but with the shared loneliness of those who knew what it was like to be alone even when surrounded by others. He exhaled, a smile tinged with sadness crossing his face. "I did. My father for a time. But he passed when I was older, and the people around me after that, they were partners, associates. Not friends. Not family." Sarah looked down, processing this. For a moment, she wasn't the girl fending for herself and her brothers. She was just a child, vulnerable and searching for connection. "It's hard," she whispered, "trusting people." "I know," Alexander said, his voice low but firm. "But it's worth it. Not everyone will let you down." There was silence, broken only by the distant clamor of the city beyond the walls. When she looked up again, her eyes glistened. "Mikey's been saying you're like a hero in one of his comics," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I told him heroes don't wear suits." Alexander laughed, a sound so genuine it surprised them both. "Well, maybe it's time we changed that," he replied. The humor cracked the last layer of tension between them, and for the first time, Sarah's laughter joined his, a rare melodic sound that transformed the small room. The next few days were filled with moments like that. Shared jokes, stories swapped, and the tentative weaving of trust. Alexander found himself invested not just in the children's survival, but in their joy. He spent time helping them learn to use the new supplies, teaching Tommy how to draw superheroes, and showing Mikey how to read some of the simpler storybooks. The final touches to the renovation came one evening when Alexander brought in a soft rug and a string of warm fairy lights. He hung them along the walls, their glow casting the room in a gentle golden hue. The children's faces lit up with awe as the lights twinkled, transforming the once gray room into something out of a dream. Sarah watched quietly, leaning against the doorframe. When Alexander caught her eye, she straightened, wiping her eyes quickly. "It looks nice," she said, her voice steady but soft. "It's just the beginning," Alexander replied. He glanced around at the room, now filled with new life. "But I'll be here as long as you need me." She didn't say anything at first, only nodded, but her expression spoke louder than words. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Weeks turned into months, and the space Alexander had once approached as an outsider now felt like a second home. The children grew more comfortable with him, and Sarah's trust in him solidified, though it remained cautious. It was during one of these visits, as the last streaks of sunlight bathed the room in a warm orange glow, that Alexander knew it was time for the truth. He sat across from Sarah, who was helping Mikey button his coat, while Tommy read one of the donated books nearby. The scene was one of quiet normalcy, but Alexander's chest tightened with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Sarah," he said, his tone gentler than usual, "there's something you should know about me." She looked up, brows knitted in concern. He hadn't seen that look since their first meeting, and it pained him to know he was about to bring it back, even if only briefly. "I haven't been entirely honest about who I am. My name is Alexander Warren, and I'm not just a man in a suit. I'm a businessman, one of the wealthiest in the city." He paused, letting the words settle. Tommy looked up, eyes wide. "Like really rich?" he asked, the innocence in his voice cutting through the tension. Alexander chuckled, nodding. "Yes, Tommy, really rich." Sarah's expression hardened, her jaw tightening as she looked away, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "Why tell us now?" she asked, her voice low, controlled. "Because you deserve the truth," Alexander said. "And because I don't want you to think that my help comes with strings. It doesn't. I've seen what you've been through, and I don't want anything from you other than to know you're safe and taken care of." The silence that followed felt heavy, but Alexander held his ground, allowing Sarah the space to process. She took a deep breath, glancing at her brothers before speaking. "It doesn't change what you did, or what we needed," she said finally, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "It shouldn't," Alexander agreed, his voice steady. "But I know it might make it hard to trust me. I wanted you to know that I'm not here out of guilt or obligation. I'm here because I care." Mikey, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, climbed onto Alexander's lap. "Are you still going to visit us?" he asked, his tiny voice a mixture of concern and hope. Alexander's heart swelled at the simple question. He met Sarah's eyes, searching for a sign of what she wanted him to say. When she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned back to Mikey. "Yes, I will. Always." A collective breath seemed to release in the room. Tommy, unable to stay serious for long, piped up. "Does that mean we're going to get more superhero comics?" Laughter, genuine and bright, filled the space, cutting through the tension. Alexander smiled, ruffling Tommy's hair. "It means whatever you need, we'll figure it out." As the evening wore on and the children fell asleep, Sarah sat beside Alexander, still quiet but no longer distant. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither do I," Alexander said, surprised at how true it felt. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." She nodded, the gesture tentative but real. "Thank you for everything." Alexander felt the tightness in his chest release, replaced by a warmth that spread to every part of him. "You're welcome," he said, watching the twinkling lights on the wall. For the first time in years, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Days after his revelation, Alexander's visits took on a new dimension. No longer shrouded in mystery, he was more open about his life, sharing stories from his past that mirrored some of Sarah's struggles. The children's initial awe over his wealth waned, replaced by comfort in his steady presence. They had come to know him not as the millionaire Alexander Warren, but simply Alexander, the man who sat with them through cold evenings, read to them by the soft glow of fairy lights, and listened without judgment. One afternoon, as the winter sun cast long shadows across the room, Sarah brought out a small box from under her cot. Its edges were worn, the lid scratched and faded. She looked at Alexander, who had just finished helping Mikey build a tower from wooden blocks. "This was my mom's," she said, voice tight with both nostalgia and pain. She placed the box on the table between them. "She kept little things in it, photos, letters, pieces of our life before everything changed." Alexander's eyes softened as he traced the delicate carvings on the lid. "Would you like to show me?" he asked gently. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the latch. Then with a nod she opened it. Inside were photographs of a family happier and whole. Two parents, faces bright with love, arms wrapped protectively around their children. There were scraps of paper with messy, childlike handwriting and a pressed flower, its petals fragile and pale. "That was from our backyard," Sarah said, pointing at the flower. "Before we had to leave." Alexander could see the shimmer of tears she refused to shed. He picked up one of the photos, a candid shot of Sarah, younger and smiling with carefree joy. The contrast to the girl sitting before him now was stark, and it stirred something deep inside him. "Thank you for sharing this," he said, placing the photo back with care. "I know it's not easy." She nodded, wiping at her eyes quickly. "I don't talk about them much. It hurts, but I think they'd be glad that someone else cares. That you're here." The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of understanding, the kind that spoke louder than words. Alexander reached out, covering her small hand with his own. "They'd be proud of you, Sarah. You're stronger than most people I know." Before she could respond, a knock at the door broke the moment. Sarah's eyes widened as she rushed to open it, revealing Mrs. Greer from Community Outreach and a few staff members. They held bags filled with school supplies and warm clothes, their smiles wide. "Sarah, Alexander, sorry to interrupt," Mrs. Greer said, eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "We're here to drop off some supplies for the kids. And we have news." Alexander stood, curiosity piqued. "News?" Mrs. Greer nodded. "The fund you started is already making a difference. We've arranged scholarships and support programs for children like Sarah and her brothers. And if you're willing, we'd like to include you both in an upcoming outreach event to share your story." Sarah's eyes darted from Mrs. Greer to Alexander, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of surprise and pride. "Our story," she echoed, the idea foreign but exciting. Alexander's smile was soft, encouraging. "Yes, Sarah. Your story deserves to be told." A smile slowly bloomed on her face, cautious but hopeful. For the first time, she didn't feel like a hidden part of the city, surviving unnoticed. She felt seen and she liked it. As the team set down the supplies and prepared to leave, Alexander caught Sarah's gaze. In it he saw gratitude, trust, and something deeper, perhaps the beginnings of peace. And as the evening unfolded, with laughter and conversations that spilled into the night, Alexander felt the once distant idea of connection become something tangible and true. The outreach event was held in the community center, a space transformed with banners, tables full of food, and a small stage at the front. It bustled with families, volunteers, and local officials eager to see how the new fund, inspired by Alexander's initiative, was making an impact. Alexander arrived early, dressed in a simple shirt and jacket, feeling both anticipation and an unfamiliar flutter of nerves. He glanced around until his eyes settled on Sarah and her brothers, standing in the corner, wide-eyed at the crowd. Sarah wore a new dress, a gift from Mrs. Greer, which she had almost refused out of habit. But today was different. Today she wanted to stand tall. Alexander walked over, bending down to Mikey's level. "Are you ready, buddy?" he asked, ruffling the boy's hair. Mikey giggled, nodding eagerly, while Tommy, clutching a well-loved comic book, flashed a grin. "I think they're ready," Sarah said, the corners of her lips curving into a small, determined smile. Soon, the event commenced, with speeches from officials and introductions of new programs aimed at helping children in need. Then Mrs. Greer stepped forward, microphone in hand, her voice filling the room. "Today we have a story to share, one that embodies resilience, kindness, and the power of community. I'd like to invite Alexander Warren and Sarah to the stage." There was a moment of hesitation as Sarah looked at Alexander, fear flaring in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring nod and extended his hand. She took it, gripping tightly as they walked up together, their steps synchronized by shared purpose. Alexander spoke first, recounting the story of a girl he had once followed out of curiosity, and how that simple act changed his life. His voice, usually commanding in boardrooms, carried a different weight now, a mix of humility and pride. "And this," he said, turning to Sarah, "is that girl. A girl who taught me that strength isn't measured by wealth or power, but by the willingness to fight for the people we love." The room was silent, captivated by the honesty in his words. Sarah took a breath, stepping up to the microphone. She scanned the crowd, her gaze landing on Mikey and Tommy, who watched her with wide eyes full of admiration. "We were scared," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And there were days we didn't know if we'd make it. But people like Mr. Warren, and now all of you, showed us that we're not alone. And that makes all the difference." Applause erupted, filling the room with warmth. Sarah looked at Alexander, a tear slipping down her cheek, and this time, she let it fall. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that this was her moment as much as his. The event wrapped up with promises of ongoing support, and new faces stepping forward to volunteer and donate. Families shared stories, inspired by what they had heard. The community center, once just a space, became a cradle of hope. As the evening wound down, Sarah found Alexander sitting on the edge of the stage, watching the people around him with a soft, reflective smile. She sat beside him, swinging her legs absently. "What happens now?" she asked, the question not filled with fear, but with genuine curiosity. He looked at her, the girl who had transformed his life simply by being herself. "Now we keep going. Together." She nodded, eyes sparkling with a light that hadn't been there before. "Good," she said, a grin breaking through. "Because I don't think you're allowed to leave us now." Alexander laughed, a sound that echoed through the room and merged with the murmur of happy voices. "I wouldn't dream of it." In the months that followed, the fund grew, helping countless other children in the city who, like Sarah, needed someone to believe in them. The old building where they once huddled in fear was replaced by a community center named after Sarah's parents, a tribute to the spirit of resilience that had driven her to keep going. And for Alexander, every moment spent there was a reminder that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in lives changed, in laughter shared, and in the bonds that turned strangers into family.